pour tous!
The Three Musketeers is a legendary tale that has been enjoyed by generations in readers, adapted for the theater, comic books, musicals, and especially movies.
Alexandre Dumas' talent really lends itself to the silver screen.
He writes more than novels, he writes myths.
In our collective imagination, the Musketeers spend their time fighting duels, foiling plots, and saving the honor of the Queen and King of France.
Dumas' heroes are larger than life, gentlemen soldiers galloping around.
They fought at the drop of a hat. Porthos' baldric, Aramis's handkerchief. It all fits perfectly. One fought for honor, even if it meant dying.
These fictional musketeers have since overshadowed the real musketeers, the king's company that played a key role in maintaining the power of the throne.
The king's musketeers belonged to an elite corps.
These were men who were willing to die for their king.
From 1665, the Musketeers were part of most of Louis XIV's military engagements.
Were they really involved in the affairs of the crown?
The idea of the Three Musketeers sounds totally convoluted, but it's all authentic.
Louis XIII and the Count of Tréville were extremely close.
Did these four musketeers, Athos, Porthos, Aramis, and D'Artagnan, really exist?
They did exist, and they served in the company of the Musketeers during the same period as D'Artagnan.
Were they at all like the characters invented by Dumas?
We have a misleading vision of D'Artagnan, the beplumed hero fighting for honor.
Tous pour un pour tous!
Helped by the very best historians, we will try to separate fact from fiction
This is not the real Musketeers' motto.
and trace the history of these glorious 17th and 18th century French military corps made famous by Alexandre Dumas.
If Alexandre Dumas had not devoted a novel to the Musketeers, nobody would have ever heard of them.
It's time to lift the veil of fiction and reveal hitherto unknown truths. Let's finally discover the real history of the Musketeers. On March 14, 1844, a newspaper, La Cycla, published the first installment of a historical serial entitled The Three Musketeers. Written by Alexandre Dumas, the serial tells the story of D'Artagnan and his desire to join the elite troupe of the Musketeers. It was an immediate success, so much so that it was published as a novel just a few months later. Within 2 years, it was enjoying international success. In less than 3 years, 2 further sagas were written, 20 years later, and the Vicomte de Barcelona.
The Three Musketeers enjoyed huge success, which can be gauged by the number of editions, especially the fact that very soon illustrated editions began to appear, which was another mark of success.
With these 3 books, Alexandre Dumas created a radical new genre, the swashbuckler. It holds a prominent place in modern culture, inspiring theatrical productions, sequels, ballets, musicals, and has most notably been adapted for the big screen. Nearly 80 versions have been made, the first of them as early as 1903, and they are still being produced today. Dumas' Musketeers are heroes, full of panache, endlessly defending their honor in duels and saving France's improbable affairs of state. This image is so deeply rooted in our imagination that we know almost nothing about the real Musketeers, who did actually exist between 1622 and 1775. Let's go back 4 centuries. The early years of the reign of Louis XIII were particularly troubled and dangerous.
You have to realize that the early 17th century was a turbulent period for the monarchy. The wars of religion were ongoing, and Louis XIII's father, Henry IV, had been assassinated.
The young king wanted bodyguards who could protect him. In 1622, he created a new military corps, the King's Musketeers.
The king's musketeers belonged to an elite corps, attached to what was known as the House of the King.
Their primary mission was to ensure the king's personal safety, but only when he left a royal residence. So the Musketeers would escort the royal procession to its destination, then leave as soon as the king entered his residence.
Once inside, the bodyguards took over. Their first mission is to ensure the king's safety.
The Musketeers were regarded almost as servants of the king. Moreover, their dress, the helmets they wore, were servants' dress. The hours of guard duty, service, and training is an aspect we obviously don't see in the novel.
While their role was first and foremost to protect the throne, they had other less well-known missions, such as their primary military role.
The Musketeers were among the jewels of the royal troops, with not only a ceremonial role, but also a combat role. They were present on the battlefields.
It was a small unit, but it more than once decided the outcome of a battle.
They were a little like shock troops, kind of the Royal Army's special forces.
These were fighting units with extremely tough military training, both on horseback and on foot. They knew how to wage war.
They were often used in the first assault against the enemy. They were very young and had a huge casualty rate.
These were men who were willing to die for the king.
They played a key role, for example, in their first battle in 1627, guaranteeing the king's victory over the Protestants at Saint-Martin-du-Ré. The Musketeers took a great many risks.
They tended to embody heroism, heroism being the ability to risk your life.
It was part of the nobility's set of military values. A show of total fearlessness on the battlefield in the face of death was rewarded with glory. And glory trumps death. Honor trumps death.
When Louis XIII created the Company of the Musketeers, at first there were only about 100 of them. The king wanted elite soldiers, hand-picked, men trained in the best military battles. In Dumas's novel, D'Artagnan's first challenge is joining these shock troops. He is young, noble, penniless, and a Gascon.
In 1622, Louis XIII insisted on the need to recruit seasoned soldiers for his corps. Thus, many of the cadets in Gascony, where D'Artagnan was from, were taken.
D'Artagnan's journey is quite representative of that of young gentlemen from the provinces who entered into the service of the king and forged a career.
To be a musketeer, it was important for young nobles to have enough money to meet their daily needs.
When you joined the Company of Musketeers, the king provided only three things: a uniform with helmet and jacket, a musket, and lodgings. The horse, which was obligatory since these were mounted infantrymen, was at the musketeer's own expense. Likewise, his daily food and other clothing needs.
But what was needed more than money was a real network of influence.
You did not become a musketeer without a recommendation, usually from a nobleman or a minister or the like.
And for that, being from Gascony was also an advantage. But why this preference for a region of France so far away from the seat of power? Quite simply because Louis XIII's father, Henry IV, was himself a Gascon. Thus, to ensure the loyalty of those who protected him, he would recruit gentlemen from his home region. It was a habit which was to last.
There was almost a Gascon mafia in Paris, such that Gascons brought in their cousins, brothers, and relatives. As soon as a high-ranking military position needed to be filled, a Gascon was brought in.
Before joining this elite unit, young men should ideally have served in the army. They needed a mastery of both horsemanship and dancing, which was necessary for body maintenance and for their rank.
You had to be a man of the salons, a man of reputation, so you had to know how to dance.
And of course, swordcraft. Fencing was an integral part of the life of a musketeer.
Fights were frequent. The musketeers were gentlemen, and honor is a delicate matter. So, Dumas and Maquet succeeded in recreating a convincing historical setting. They fought at the drop of a hat, Porthos's baldric, Aramis's handkerchief. It all fits perfectly. One fought for honor, even if it meant dying.
But contrary to Dumas's spectacular duels, with their dramatic twists and turns, in reality such fights would be short-lived, typically lasting less than a minute. The sole objective was to defeat an opponent as quickly as possible.
When a musketeer was defending his honor in, say, a duel, he would seek out a specific sword, one that had a strong guard, but more importantly, a very long blade, which might exceed 4 feet in length. Then there was no edge. It was really designed to thrust, so the tip is the important part. Obviously, the hand has to be protected to deflect blows, to gain an advantage over the opponent. You need the longest reach possible, so this is an extremely long sword. These are light weapons, weighing about 3 pounds, which actually gives you a terrific reach. This is extremely fast, extremely dynamic fencing, as you try to lodge these small tips of steel in your opponent's belly.
Even more surprising is that in the 17th century, duels were strictly forbidden. They were considered crimes of lèse-majesté.
Every year, several hundred or even several thousand young noblemen died in duels, so it became absolutely necessary to stop this carnage.
In 1627 alone, 4,000 noblemen were killed in duels. It was a scourge that weakened the military command of the French forces. In 1627, an edict issued by Cardinal Richelieu, First Minister of King Louis XIII, prohibited dueling.
2 men fighting a duel were taking the law into their own hands, and therefore not submitting themselves to the justice of the king, or even God.
Anyone caught dueling faced decapitation. And yet nothing could stop the noblemen.
The soldiers of the watch were out on patrol, but duelers were undeterred.
Dueling allows a young gentleman to get himself noticed. Throwing down your gauntlet in a tavern may have been forbidden, but it was a way to show your honor, to forge reputation, and make a name for yourself. Because having a reputation led to being given commands. This is the paradox of dueling, which, while illegal, was also a way to get ahead in your career.
The Musketeers, then, were noblemen, trained in dancing, riding, and fencing. But they were also soldiers who had mastered several fighting techniques and the use of sophisticated weapons.
The king's musketeers were already innovative because they were mounted infantry. At that time, they were a hybrid troop, meaning they fought on foot as well as on horseback.
They owe their name to their weapon. This was a formidable technological innovation and the forerunner to the rifle, the musket. The few remaining examples are kept in military museums.
The Musketeers always fought on foot with this huge, very large caliber firearm. It weighed about 10 to 12 pounds, firing a lead ball between 1/2 and 3/4 of an inch in diameter. So, a very large caliber weapon, bearing in mind that at this time, many fighters still wore a full suit of armor, like the one behind me. So you needed firearms that could pierce this kind of armor. The musket was so heavy that to shoulder it, you needed a rest, a forked stick, called a forquin, to hold up the barrel of the weapon and support the weight of the gun. It is an extraordinarily rudimentary system. In reality, it was a weapon that could be used en masse. The whole group would fire at the enemy, spraying them with lead shot, before launching into hand-to-hand combat.
In general, when an enemy saw the musketeers charging, they would discharge their muskets. They would then drop their weapons, or at least run away from their lines, because they knew that once the musketeers reached them, they were in for a really hard time. In general, musketeers did not give any quarter. Prisoners were executed, which did not go against the spirit of the noble ideal, given that the victor had the right of life and death over his prisoner.
The Musketeers were above all noblemen and elite soldiers, charged with protecting the king and defending his name in military battles. Troops whose name made an opponent shudder. And yet,
if Alexandre Dumas had not devoted a novel to Musketeers, nobody would have ever heard of them.
how did a romantic 19th century author develop a passion for the military under Louis XIII? In 1840, Alexandre Dumas was first and foremost a writer looking for success. He had achieved fame with plays that were popular all over Paris, but his career had stalled. Above all, he needed money.
Alexandre Dumas had a champagne lifestyle. He enjoyed being extravagant and munificent. He was a man who lived without counting the cost.
On June 21, 1843, a trip to Marseille changed Alexandre Dumas' destiny. The author went to the municipal library looking for documentation. But one book dating from 1700 caught his eye.
He came across the memoirs of Monsieur d'Artagnan. He took the book home and spent the night reading it, devouring it, and it fired his enthusiasm.
He said he kept the book and never returned it to the library in Marseille, and this is where the idea of a serial was born.
Dumas then based his tale on the real life of d'Artagnan, a musketeer who had his moment of glory in the 17th century under Louis XIV. The memoir, however, turned out to be fake.
D'Artagnan's memoirs were clearly not written by D'Artagnan, rather by a polygrapher named Gatien Cortels de Sandras, who fought in various campaigns during the Dutch War. He was dismissed in 1678 at the end of the Dutch War and took up writing for a living.
It is not known whether Cortels de Sandras knew the real d'Artagnan, but he knew enough to combine fact and fiction. Inventing a character named Milady, he tells the story of a friendship between three musketeers named Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, and makes d'Artagnan a mouthpiece for condemnation of absolute monarchy.
When it came out in 1700, all d'Artagnan's acquaintances, including those close to him, were outraged.
It's obvious that the character of D'Artagnan, even in 1700, was of interest to the public.
But Dumas had a special fondness for this reinvented character of d'Artagnan.
Dumas was fascinated by Cortels de Sandras' central character, the imaginary musketeer. Dumas was doing what D'Artagnan did, fighting duels, throwing down the gauntlet at the slightest provocation over a mistress or a theatrical flop.
Dumas modeled his character on his own story, shaping his destiny in a very personal way.
The tale echoes provincials like Dumas, a boy with a good education who comes to Paris from his native region and has to forge a career and make something of himself when he has nothing. Dumas arrives determined to have Paris at his feet, which he manages to achieve. And D'Artagnan is like that. He gives D'Artagnan some very personal traits: intrepidness, courage, a sense of humor, a taste for women. All personality traits possessed by Alexandre Dumas.
Dumas makes the characters of d'Artagnan and the Musketeers chivalrous and ill-disciplined. The king's real musketeers, though, were men tasked with consolidating monarchic power who were above all subject to the personal authority of the king.
This was the beginning of royal absolutism, when the monarchy was increasingly concentrating its powers, culminating in the reign of Louis XIV, which really was the period of the absolute monarchy.
The king insisted on meeting every musketeer. Names were submitted to him, and they were either accepted or refused.
12 years after its creation, the king himself took command of the company.
In 1634, the king himself took the title of captain, leading the light cavalry, the gendarmes, and the musketeers. The real acting captain, though, was the captain-lieutenant.
In 1634, the Count of Tréville took over this position, a man who would achieve notoriety thanks to Dumas. a garçon who called the shots within the company.
He was actually the Count of Troisville, but with his Bern accent, it sounded like Count Tréville, so that's what it became.
Tréville was an example of this Gascon aristocracy, which naturally placed itself in the military service of the king.
Understandably, all the young officer cadets feared the captain of the Musketeers, for he was a man of strong character. This too corresponds to historical reality.
He was known for being a difficult man and was apt to tear up a document handed to him right in front of Queen Anne of Austria. Nevertheless, he displayed unfailing courage and loyalty to Louis XIII, which is why the king held him in such high regard.
Louis XIII and the Count of Tréville became extremely close.
He was one of the few to have direct access to the bedroom of the king, who would brief him before going to bed with regard to surveillance of the royal houses.
Tréville, though, was despised by Cardinal Richelieu, one of the most powerful men in the country, who in 1624 became an influential first minister of the state. Richelieu was also a central character in Dumas' books.
Thanks to Dumas, Richelieu has become a world-famous historical figure. Unfortunately, the novels caricature Richelieu, making him a manipulative figure who exercises a secret parallel power, torturing people in cellars, etc. This is all purely fictional and has no basis in reality.
Contrary to what Dumas tells us, there was no rivalry between Louis XIII and Richelieu.
Richelieu manages to become Louis XIII's right-hand man. While the king is wary of his character and his intelligence, he understands that Richelieu is the kind of intelligent man he needs.
The cardinal was an excellent strategist who served the monarchy well. He successfully consolidated royal authority and made France a great power.
It was most notably Louis XIII and Richelieu who established the political concept of absolute monarchy.
Thanks to Richelieu's policies, by the mid-17th century, France became Europe's leading economic, political, and military power.
After the king, Richelieu was the most important figure in the state, and to ensure his safety, he too had a company of musketeers. The cardinal's musketeers were fewer in number and could be identified by their red helmets.
Obviously, it's easy to stage a rivalry between the king's musketeers, who are on the side of good, and the cardinal's musketeers, who are of course on the side of evil, since Dumas chose to portray Cardinal Richelieu as a malevolent figure.
It's not impossible that there were fights between the king's musketeers and the cardinal's guards, but the rivalry wasn't so much between Richelieu and Louis XIII as between Tréville's men and Richelieu's.
The cardinal's musketeers were seasoned, serious men and not very quarrelsome. The reality, however, is that the king's musketeers liked to fight with the Paris Watch.
A small armed force called the Archers of the Watch was charged with guarding the capital, and they would encounter the young musketeers, who were nice lads, proud to belong to the king's court, close to the sovereign, etc., but a bit full of themselves. So they would constantly talk down to the archers, saying, "Let me pass, you rogue." This would often end in a fight, where blows would be struck with the flat part of their sword. The goal was to humiliate the watch archers, and it resulted in frequent fights, so that's pretty much the historical reality.
A historical reality skillfully reimagined by Dumas.
Dumas' heroes are larger than life, gentlemen soldiers galloping around.
In order to fill the serialized saga with a veritable tsunami of spectacular twists and turns, making it a huge success from the very first installment.
Success came quickly for the Musketeers, with readers immediately hooked, as Dumas invented extraordinary situations for the reader's pleasure.
Basically, that was his job, and it's what the public wanted.
Very soon, The Three Musketeers was published in book form. Within a few months, English, German, Italian, Spanish, Russian, Swedish, and many other translations appeared.
It also helps that it is translated into English, and so it achieves a market not only in Britain, but in the British Empire, and in the former British Empire, the United States of America as well.
This is a major factor. He writes more than novels, he writes myths.
Des mythes.
A clue to the worldwide impact of Dumas' work can be found in Chapter 9, in the famous exclamation, "All for one and one for all," the Musketeers' motto.
This is not the real motto of the Musketeers. Their actual Musketeer motto is Quo ruit et letum, which is much less cheerful.
Where it falls is death.
And we see a cannonball striking a city.
This is obviously a motto embroidered on the signs of the Musketeer Corps.
Even more astonishing is the fact that Dumas' motto, "All for one and one for all," is uttered only once in the entire series, even though it has become totally synonymous with the Three Musketeers.
We are more used to hearing it now in its other form, all for one and one for all. Why is that? Because that's how the line is delivered in the movies. But it changes the meaning a little. Saying one for all and all for one puts the individual first, but in all for all, the collective comes first.
One of the main features of the novel is the friendship between D'Artagnan and his three comrades, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis.
They existed and served in the company of the Musketeers during the same period as D'Artagnan. Athos was the most mysterious. His real name was Armand de Selegue d'Athos d'Hauteville. He joined the Musketeers when he was about 20 years old.
He had a very short career, and his corpse was picked up on the Pré aux Clercs, which was actually a location where duels took place in Paris, very soon after he returned to the Musketeers. This is a far cry from the mysterious gentleman portrayed by Dumas.
He is buried in Saint-Sulpice, which is the parish of the Musketeers. As for Porthos, we are lucky enough to have his baptism certificate.
His name is Isaac de Porto. Isaac suggests that he was probably a Protestant, since Protestants often gave biblical names to their children. He had a short career in the Musketeers and then returned home.
He had a position at a powder house in a small fortified city in Béarn called Navarrenx, where for many years Paul de Batz de Castamol, D'Artagnan's younger brother, was governor.
Aramis corresponds to a certain Henri de Aramis, who did not necessarily have the religious vocation recounted by Dumas.
His family were lay abbots. Béarn is unusual in that you can be an abbot there without actually being a clergyman. So Dumas made him the ecclesiastic of the group simply because of that.
All three then are characters whose existence can be vouched for, just like D'Artagnan.
D'Artagnan is a historical character. He really did exist. Charles de Batz de Castelmore.
He was a gentleman from Gascon who joined the French Guards Regiment at a very young age, and later the company of Musketeers. In around 1632, he left his native Gascon to go to Paris, where he enlisted in the service of King Louis XIII.
It's not clear when D'Artagnan joined the Musketeers. It's known that he was part of them in 1633, but we don't know exactly when he joined and how long he was there for. But the first historical mention of D'Artagnan is in 1633.
D'Artagnan was the nephew of a musketeer who died in a battle at the siege of La Rochelle in 1628, where Tréville himself was also wounded. It is likely that D'Artagnan met Tréville on his way to Paris.
These characters had important functions within the company of Musketeers. For example, Aramis and Athos were cousins of Tréville, and Porthos was actually a brother-in-law of Tréville.
It is also known that D'Artagnan fought in the military campaigns of the 1640s, at least in the Royal Guard. During these same years, we also know that Aramis served in the Musketeers, as did Porthos and Athos.
There were years when they were together in the company, and as there were only maybe 100 men, they would doubtless have encountered each other, and it may be that they got along.
It is impossible to know whether or not they were friends, but they very likely knew each other. We are sure that Athos, Porthos, and Aramis were no longer musketeers after 1645, so their participation in affairs of the state would have been zero, especially as Louis XIII used them mainly for military purposes at the time.
Louis XIII is a great military man and spent more time in army camps and bivouacs than he did in his palaces. His reign was nothing if not busy on the military front.
On the other hand, it is clear that behind the adventures romanticized by Dumas, the key figure of D'Artagnan is portrayed not as a musketeer, but as a messenger, as in the famous affair of the Queen's studs.
The case of the Three Musketeers seems completely convoluted. The business of Anne of Austria's love affair with Buckingham, the improbable gift that the Queen makes to the English ambassador of her diamond studs, which are taken to England, with one stolen by a spy to basically expose the Queen's misconduct. All this is taken from the memoirs of La Rochefoucauld that inspired Dumas.
But the author, François de La Rochefoucauld, was known to enjoy stirring up rumors and was apt to spread false information.
La Rochefoucauld tells the story in which D'Artagnan was not involved.
No matter, Alexandre Dumas was inspired by history.
They are based in historical fact. During the Treaty of Amiens, the Queen, walking in the gardens, met the Duke of Buckingham, and it seems he made advances to her. She cried out, and the Duke ran away.
Nothing scandalous actually happened between them.
Some people in upper echelons of the English elite are determined to discredit Buckingham by insinuating that he is in fact a man with amorous intentions towards the Queen of France.
Rumor, fake news, whatever, it was an opportunity for Dumas to appropriate pieces of historical fact and weave them into a thrilling tale.
Dumas elaborated things a little. We know that someone went to England to retrieve the famous studs. As luck would have it, it was D'Artagnan. In short, he integrated it into his story to give it some romance.
D'Artagnan could not possibly have been involved in the story of the Queen's studs. It is historically impossible for two reasons.
The story of the studs involves the musketeers working in the service of the Queen, unbeknownst to the king. Historically speaking, this is impossible. The musketeers served the king and would only ever go on missions ordered by the king.
Dumas clearly makes D'Artagnan younger, having him arrive in Paris as early as 1625. The real D'Artagnan's career was a little later. Basically, D'Artagnan's real chief was Mazarin and then Louis XIV.
The story of the studs dates from 1625. It was impossible for D'Artagnan to have been a part of it. He was, though, a royal messenger in the 1640s. Louis XIII died in 1643, a few months after Richelieu. As his son, Louis XIV, was still a child, Anne of Austria, his mother, became regent, supported by the new Prime Minister, Cardinal Mazarin.
Mazarin worked alongside Cardinal Richelieu, who earmarked him as an extremely clever man. He was both a diplomat and a military man.
Mazarin decided to dissolve the Company of Musketeers in 1646. It was a smart way to sideline the Count du Treville, who he mistrusted, just as Richelieu mistrusted him.
Louis XIV, who was only 5 years old in 1643, was too young to have any real confidence in Treville. Mazarin did not trust Treville, and with good reason, since Treville had plotted to assassinate his predecessor, the first minister, Cardinal Richelieu.
When the Company of Musketeers was disbanded in 1646, unlike many of his companions, D'Artagnan remained in Paris. He remained in the service of the king, the young Louis XIV, the regent Anne of Austria, and the new First Minister Mazarin. In 1646, he was already what was called a creature of his eminence.
It was then that France was beset by a large-scale revolt known as the Fronde. In 1648, an uprising against the royal power began among the nobility and the people.
It was a very complex movement that set in motion the Parliament of Paris along with other senior figures. It was a rather regressive movement that was uncomfortable with burgeoning state power, particularly the rise in taxation.
Faced with the prospect of a civil war, Mazarin found himself in great difficulty.
The problem he has is that he is not French and is therefore hated by a large chunk of the French elite and a large chunk of the French population whose minds are poisoned against him.
Mazarin appears as a kind of Richelieu Mark II, but lacked Richelieu's political clout and authority.
It was a period in which Mazarin needed above all to help Anne of Austria protect the young king and the monarchy. Some saw in this political alliance an emotional attachment.
Mazarin obviously had very privileged relations with the Queen. In fact, some of their correspondence suggests a certain intimacy.
Whether that is true or not of the relationship between Mazarin and Anne, they were certainly very, very close. They were locked into a relationship of mutual dependency on a political level.
It was at this moment that historically, the real D'Artagnan helped safeguard the monarchy.
This was an extremely difficult period, and the Queen, the Regent Anne of Austria, was forced to send her first minister into exile.
During the Fronde, D'Artagnan served as a messenger between Mazarin and Louis XIV and Anne of Austria.
He had to take roads crawling with brigands and spies. While many of Mazarin's other messengers were arrested by the rebels, D'Artagnan always managed to escape them. Neither the king nor the queen would ever forget D'Artagnan's loyalty, courage, and skill.
Some musketeers joined the rebellion, leaving D'Artagnan at the center of a political game. But he was very loyal to the monarchy, which is, of course, why he was rewarded.
Mazarin helped the Queen of France to restore order and protect Louis XIV, who duly became king in 1654. In 1657, 11 years after the first company had been disbanded, the Musketeers were reformed.
The king needed to unite around him a guard that reflected his authority, his power, and ensured his security.
The king's guard was enlarged by re-establishing the company of Musketeers.
D'Artagnan became a sub-lieutenant in the company, and this is how he came to meet the young Louis XIV.
Louis XIV was just 19 years old, and he saw this army as a way of establishing his authority. In his last opus, Dumas has Mazarin urging the king to forego a first minister. It is impossible to know whether the sentence was actually uttered, but it tells a story. Louis XIV, traumatized by the Fronde and the revolt of the nobles, trusted no one and continued his father's objective of establishing an all-powerful throne, the famous absolute monarchy.
Louis XIV's form of absolute monarchy is very much a personal form of absolute monarchy, and it's only really possible with a man of such enormous stamina and memory that Louis XIV has.
The Musketeers were fully involved in this project, assuming more and more functions in support of royal rule. Their primary function remained focused on military matters.
In 1665, the king ordered his generals not to spare the soldiers of his guard, and from that period onwards, the Musketeers took part in most of Louis XIV's military engagements.
It is known, for example, that they participated in the siege of Maastricht in 1673, the siege of Valenciennes in 1677, of Mons in 1691, and of Namur in 1692.
They were often given the most dangerous missions. For example, when part of the ramparts on an enemy fortress had been destroyed by cannons, and a corps of brave men was needed to burst through the breach and attack the enemy.
Very often, they decided the outcome of the battle. At the siege of Valenciennes in 1677, in just 3/4 of an hour during the first assault, the city fell to a handful of musketeers. Just 20, maybe 50 musketeers managed to storm the city.
Their second function was to carry out special missions, especially entrusted to them by the king, like the one the king gave D'Artagnan during the Nicolas Fouquet affair.
Fouquet was the superintendent of finance, as a kind of super minister of finance.
Fouquet is not just a finance minister. He is in effect the chief banker of the realm. He is lending his own money to the monarchy in a desperate situation that the monarchy is in the 1650s. And I think it puts him in a very, very powerful position, more powerful than any subject really ought to be in as far as Louis XIV is concerned.
Fouquet was a particularly wealthy minister, and more importantly, he had an excellent network of influence, surrounded by a whole court of gentlemen who respected and admired him.
Fouquet was all about hype, to coin a modern term. Basically, he had a nose for the remarkable and knew what would be the envy of foreign states. He helped launch the careers of La Fontaine, Lebrun, Lavaux, all the great talents associated with the reign of Louis XIV, men who brought the king honor. So Louis XIV soon became jealous.
History remembers Nicolas Fouquet's glittering party at Vaux-le-Vicomte, a party so sumptuous that it convinced Louis XIV, one of the many guests present, that his minister had overstepped the mark.
When he sees what Fouquet has produced at Vaux-le-Vicomte, he regards it as absolutely magnificent. But he also puts two and two together and thinks, well, where on earth did all the money come from to create this magnificent paradise on earth in the heart of France? So Fouquet, of course, also in that respect, digs his own grave.
In addition to this influence, Fouquet was accused of embezzling money from the kingdom's coffers and constructing a fort at Bellay-le-en-Mer.
It came to light that Fouquet had fortified the island's port, bringing over several dozen cannons and other military equipment without informing the king. This inevitably angered Louis, who quickly decided to have him arrested.
Louis XIV had him arrested in Nantes in September 1661. The arrest had to be carried out in the greatest secrecy. The mission called for trustworthy men, and the king soon decided on D'Artagnan.
For D'Artagnan, this mission was proof of Louis XIV's absolute faith in him.
It had to be him, no one else. The king's mind was made up, no one else could be entrusted with the mission. When D'Artagnan heard this, he was said to be so shocked he almost fainted. Everything about the arrest demonstrates the faith the king placed in the Musketeers. D'Artagnan arrested Fouquet, while Musketeers on horseback waited for him in the courtyard. It was also the Musketeers who blocked the access roads to Nantes, and Musketeers who escorted Fouquet to his prison in Angers, and indeed to every other prison he was sent to. Vincent, then Pignerol, a Musketeer was even chosen to guard Fouquet until his death.
Who used it in his third volume of The Musketeers. Dumas' gamble paid off. The serial format proved to be a real money spinner. So much so, he ended up writing several at once for different newspapers. Alongside The Musketeers, he wrote Queen Margot and the Count of Monte Cristo. But how did Dumas manage to dream up so many adventures and escapades? By enlisting the help of a backroom author.
You need to realize that anything attributed to Dumas was usually the work of Dumas plus Maquet.
His collaboration with Auguste Maquet began in 1838. By the age of 19, he was the head of history classes at a Paris high school, so very familiar with French history.
Dumas came up with the ideas. Maquet took care of the research.
Once Maquet had managed to transform the idea into something resembling a story, he sent it to Dumas.
Dumas did a complete rewrite. In fact, Maquet supplied the base material from which Dumas shaped the novels. Of course, it is a collaboration, but the writing itself, the style, is Alexandre Dumas.
Dumas wrote about the adventures of the Musketeers until D'Artagnan's death. In the novel and in real life, having asked him to be Fouquet's guardian for 4 years, Louis XIV entrusted D'Artagnan with one final important mission.
Having been governor of Lille for several months, D'Artagnan was charged with accompanying the king to the siege of Maastricht.
The Franco-Dutch War was one of the toughest military campaigns Louis XIV ever conducted, and he sought out an older soldier, D'Artagnan, to command the corps of Musketeers.
It was during this campaign that on June 25, 1673, D'Artagnan fell in battle.
D'Artagnan heard a gunfight. He was eating, he was off duty. Instead of letting his companions deal with it, he got up, set aside his serviette, and went off, sword in hand, to help his comrades.
Which is where he was killed by a musket ball while passing through the Porte de Tongue.
It is said that 4 musketeers got themselves killed recovering D'Artagnan's body.
While for Dumas, the story ends with the death of D'Artagnan, in reality, the company of Musketeers lasted another century and was increasingly used for yet another function: policing.
The king could arrest anyone he wanted, and it was a role fulfilled by the Musketeers. The police dimension was really a manifestation of absolute monarchy.
They were effectively the military wing of the throne. When the Musketeers were dispatched, it was as if the king himself was calling his rebellious subjects to order.
D'Artagnan was involved in quelling one of these mutinies at Vivarais in 1670.
D'Artagnan crushed the revolt, using a great deal of violence in the process.
There were no riot police or security companies, so these troops just fired into the crowd and slaughtered the rebels.
They charged the peasants and massacred them to quell the revolt, but it was not a glorious episode for the Musketeers. In 1675, they also helped subdue the Bonnet Rouge revolt in Brittany.
The part they played depended on the circumstances. In Brittany, they killed some rioters while protecting others. Whereas in Paris, during the Flower Wars of 1775, things were a little different.
The Musketeers were deployed in Paris to guard the bakeries and charge the demonstrators on horseback. But the aim was not to kill. On the contrary, it was vital to avoid a bloodbath. As the only mounted unit stationed in Paris, the Musketeers were sent in to charge the demonstrators and scare them off. Some may have been trampled under the horses, but for the most part, the rioters scattered.
The king's musketeers also had a fourth, lesser-known function, which was training the nobility in the art of combat.
During the Franco-Dutch War, it was noticed that many army officers lacked training. The two companies of musketeers had just shone during the Dutch wars. So the king tasked them with providing military training to young men from the high nobility and aristocracy.
But by the 18th century, the company's prestige had diminished.
In the 18th century, they were used much less on the battlefield because the way war was waged had changed.
By then, it had been a long time since any king was personally present on the battlefield. Louis XIV was seldom present, Louis XV hardly ever, and Louis XVI never.
So, from a military standpoint, their privileged position within the king's guard was no longer justified.
Moreover, Vauban considerably modified military practices during the reign of Louis XIV, rendering the musketeers' particular type of heroism obsolete.
Vauban developed very efficient siege techniques, which avoided, among other things, the loss of human life. War became an extremely precise strategic discipline intended for tacticians, not jokers like D'Artagnan.
In 1775, Louis XVI disbanded the Company of Musketeers.
During the Revolution, some royalists claimed that had the Company of Musketeers still existed, Louis XVI would not have fallen, but that's an exaggeration.
40 years later, in 1814, the Company of Musketeers unexpectedly rose from the ashes when Louis XVIII decided to fully restore the unit.
It was not about making it a combat unit, since Louis XVIII had no intention of waging war in Europe, but it became a prestige company once again.
A huge number of young men wanted to be musketeers. They were seen as soldiers who embodied the values of the French spirit. And so, they met with really phenomenal success.
From this rebirth, there remain today a few shiny uniforms which cost a fortune but were hardly ever used.
The problem was that it was associated with absolute monarchy, so the existence of such a symbol of royal authority in post-revolutionary France was extremely provocative. The Musketeers were definitively disbanded in 1815.
Before being immortalized by Alexandre Dumas 40 years later, Dumas invented some extremely modern writing techniques, like the cliffhanger.
He knew how to create a sense of anticipation at the end of a chapter to capture the reader's attention.
Or a special type of scenography.
Dumas' writing has a quality of the type found in cinema, which is a flair for dialogue, combined with very visual sensibilities. He allows readers to project themselves into a scene. Another very important element is the duel, which provides action and choreography. You can hear the metallic sound of swords clashing. The duel is the music of the Musketeers.
Dumas unwittingly supplied cinema with a piece of work that would help make it famous.
Alexandre Dumas' novels have a spectacular dimension. His talent really lends itself to the silver screen.
These movie adaptations are still being produced. And the image they help propagate in the collective imagination is actually a far cry from the reality of a military corps of musketeers that was subject to the will of the king.